The nights have secrets that the days don't tell. When the body falls asleep, the soul continues to move. It is in this dark silence that unresolved pains whisper loudest, that forgotten memories return with double weight, and that old questions reappear without warning. It is no wonder that many face their greatest battles while the world rests. And in the midst of this invisible field of the nocturnal mind, there is a psalm capable of touching deep wounds and offering a type of healing that science has not yet been able to decipher. Psalm 77 begins with a muffled cry, the kind of cry that few dare to voice. He doesn't bring verses of celebration or immediate confidence. On the contrary, the psalmist reveals a heart in pieces. He can't sleep. His eyes refuse to close. He prays, but finds no comfort. It's as if the sky itself is silent. There is an unresolved tension between faith and anguish, between the memory of divine power and the feeling of abandonment. A man on vigil, not because he wants to, but because despair does not allow rest. This type of emotional state is not strange for many who today go through entire nights with their eyes fixed on the ceiling, trapped in uncontrollable thoughts. The exhausted body begs for sleep, but the mind wanders through labyrinths of anxiety. There are those who try medication, there are those who look for answers in scientific articles, and there are those who turn to meditation. But few think of opening a psalm like this in the middle of the night. And perhaps that is precisely what makes it so powerful. It does not offer a ready-made solution, but a raw identification with those who have already been there. Asaph, the author of this psalm, does not hide his suffering. He questions whether God has forgotten to be kind, whether divine compassion has been cancelled, and whether the promises made one day still have validity. These questions do not appear in ordinary sermons. They are uncomfortable because they echo the same doubts that many are ashamed to admit. However, by recording them with such honesty, the psalm becomes a mirror of the human soul, revealing that faith is not the absence of crisis, but going through the crisis without silencing the cry. While many biblical texts seek to teach, exhort, or console, this psalm allows itself to bleed. It is a raw record of the soul on the edge, and it is exactly this vulnerability that carries unexpected healing potential. When someone reads these words quietly, in the dark of a room, something subtle happens. It's not magic. It's not a formula. It's identification, a silent recognition that you are not alone in pain. There are others who have already walked through this valley. There are words that can express what even crying cannot. In the first verses, the language is heavy, full of tension. But there is a beauty hidden in this weight. It is the courage to be honest before God. There are no filters. There is no pretense. Just a man facing the divine mystery, trying to understand if it is still possible to wait for an answer. And this stance, however desperate it may seem, is in itself an act of faith. Because only those who still believe, even if little, continue talking to the invisible. This psalm begins like a storm. There is internal thunder. There are winds of doubt. But behind each verse, there is also a silent resistance. The psalmist does not abandon dialogue with God, even though the silence of heaven hurts more than any negative response. He continues. And that continuing is everything. Because on nights like these, continuing is already a miracle. Science studies the effects of sleep on emotional health. It proves that sleep deprivation worsens depression, anxiety, and even physical symptoms. But we are still far from fully understanding how spirituality works during rest. What happens to someone who sleeps after pouring out their soul in words like those in this psalm? What changes in the body, in the mind, and in the soul? These are questions that not even the most advanced laboratories can answer accurately. There is something in this psalm that escapes the control of logic. He does not organize feelings, he exposes them. It does not close wounds, but it helps to see them with different eyes. And this is often the first step towards healing. It's as if, by naming the pain, the soul is able to breathe a little better. Not because I found a solution, but because I was heard. During the early hours of the morning, when tiredness is not enough to silence the mind, words like these take on a different weight. They stop being just text and become shelter. The psalm does not promise that the problem will disappear, but it offers language for those who no longer know what to say. It allows the soul to speak without fear, without shame, without needing to appear strong. And this is more than many therapies can offer. There is a detail in this psalm that cannot be ignored. It takes place at night, and it's not just a mention of the time. Darkness plays an essential role here. She is more than the absence of light. It is a symbol of what cannot be seen, what confuses, and what silently oppresses. The psalmist describes the night as an unwanted companion, a witness to his inner collapse. His eyes remain open, not by choice, but because something stronger than tiredness keeps him awake. He refuses to be comforted, not because you reject comfort, but because you are at a point where nothing seems enough to soothe the soul. The image is powerful. A man lying down but awake, silent but screaming inside, surrounded by external and internal shadows. The mind revisits past moments, remarkable situations, promises made, and divine interventions that seem too distant to be real in the present. Repetition of this mental exercise does not bring relief. It only increases the distance between what has already been experienced and what we feel now. And, in that distance, the question arises that pierces to the bones: was all that really true? The psalmist then begins to remember times when God's presence seemed unquestionable. He remembers songs during the night, moments when the soul found relief in the memory of divine deeds. This attempt at emotional rescue, however, does not happen lightly. It's an almost painful process. Remembering the good when you experience the bad is an exercise that hurts. There is a difference between nostalgia and survival. What he does is an attempt to hold on to the memory as if it were a plank in the middle of a shipwreck. And this memory is not random. It is built with effort. The psalmist searches his own spiritual history, searching the depths of his heart, looking for some trace of meaning. He reviews the ancient miracles, the mighty actions of God in the past, and tries to find an anchor there for the present. There's no guarantee he'll succeed, but he tries anyway, because in moments of despair, memory can be the only bridge between doubt and faith. This movement of remembering is not passive. It is an act of resistance. In ancient times, when there were no accessible written records like today, remembering was a spiritual discipline. The people of Israel were trained to keep the memory of God's acts alive, transmitting stories from generation to generation. The memory was a way to keep hope alive. And that is exactly what the psalmist tries to do: rekindle a flame that pain insists on extinguishing. In doing so, he changes the tone. Little by little, the psalm stops being just a lament and begins to become a silent affirmation of faith. There is still no complete relief. There is still no resolution. But there is a shift. Anguish, previously focused on oneself, begins to open up to what lies beyond. The verbs change. He stops saying, "I feel," and starts saying, "You did." Prayer transforms, no longer centered on inner chaos, but on the greatness of God. This transition is subtle, but fundamental, because this is how healing begins, not with a miraculous snap, but with a repositioning of the gaze. When pain is all you see, it becomes greater than any other reality. But when pain is placed next to something bigger, it begins to lose strength. It doesn't disappear, but it changes shape. And this is the beginning of something new. While science tries to map the mechanisms of the brain during sleep, there are dimensions of the soul that escape any tomography. What happens inside someone who, in the midst of the dark night of the soul, decides to revisit God's powerful acts? What kind of transformation occurs when, instead of giving in to anxiety, this person allows himself to be permeated by sacred memories? Medicine recognizes that thoughts shape feelings, and feelings shape the body. But what about spiritual memories shaping hope? It is curious to notice that, even in the midst of pain, the psalmist does not abandon the practice of prayer. He keeps talking. He insists. He doesn't let the lack of response turn into the absence of dialogue. And this persistence is one of the purest forms of faith. Not the triumphalist faith, which demands signs and guarantees, but the silent faith, which refuses to give up even when everything seems mute. This faith that expresses itself in the night is a type of healing, not because it solves everything, but because it allows us to continue. There are those who think that healing is the end of pain, but there are times when healing is simply the power to go through suffering without giving in, remain, breathe, wait, even without understanding. The night continues. The psalmist is still lying down, still without sleep, but something changed, not outside of it, but inside. And this change, however small it may seem, has a real impact, because this is how you begin to be healed, when pain stops being a wall and starts to become a path. There is no specific moment in the psalm when the anguish dissolves. There is no sudden turn where darkness gives way to light dramatically. The transformation happens almost imperceptibly, like a gradual relief that seeps through the cracks in the tired soul. What can be seen throughout the verses is a change in focus. Lament no longer occupies the center. From the moment the memory of God's deeds begins to be evoked, the psalmist reorganizes the internal space, and what was once a mental battlefield begins to become fertile soil for silent faith to flourish. If this message is making sense to you so far, write Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you're following and helps this content reach more people. The gaze turns to ancient deeds, not as an escape from the present, but as a conscious exercise in realigning hope. The psalmist recalls that God opened a path in the middle of the waters, that he led the people safely through threatening landscapes, and that his presence was perceived even in the most frightening manifestations of nature. Lightning, thunder, and earthquakes, symbols of chaos and power, became, in divine hands, instruments of liberation. This type of memory is not nostalgic. It has a profound spiritual purpose, to reaffirm that the same God who acted before remains the same now. The big question is not what God did in the past, but whether he is still attentive to the present. And by reconstructing these images of divine action, the psalmist not only rekindles faith, but also rescues a lost perception of reality. That God not only existed at some distant point in history, but that his presence continues to pulsate, even if silent. There is a passage where he declares, "Your footprints were not seen." This phrase carries an immense poetic and theological density. It reveals the tension between the certainty of divine action and the absence of visible evidence. God passed by, but left no noticeable marks. Still, something has changed. This idea is disconcerting because it breaks the logic of seeing to believe. It points to a form of faith that recognizes presence even without footprints, that feels movement even without evidence. It is faith that does not need visible signs, because it already knows the character of those who act in the invisible. At this point, the psalm stops being just an individual prayer and becomes a collective song. He talks about the people, the crossing, and the leaders who guided Israel through the desert. The focus broadens. The psalmist's particular pain is part of a larger story. He is no longer alone with his anguish. Now, he is linked to a people who also went through dark valleys and found redemption. Personal memory is intertwined with collective memory, and this union offers a strength that could not be found in isolation. This transition is essential to understanding the healing power of the psalm. Often, pain intensifies in solitude. Suffering seems insurmountable when you believe you are the only one going through it. But when pain connects to a larger plot, it finds context. And in context, it also finds meaning. Suffering does not cease to exist, but it is given new meaning. It becomes part of a process and no longer an end in itself. The psalmist's journey is not linear, and this is something that needs to be understood honestly. He does not follow a predictable overcoming script. It goes back and forth. Remember, question, declare, silence. All of this coexisting. And this oscillation is not a sign of spiritual weakness. On the contrary, it reveals the depth of someone who refuses to simplify faith, who understands that believing is also fighting, that praying is also confronting, that remembering is often a way of surviving. At this point, it is possible to see how the entire psalm functions as a spiritual therapeutic process. It is not a text made just to be read, but to be lived. It demands emotional participation. He asks the reader or listener to also put themselves on this path, recognizing their own sleepless nights, their painful memories, their uncomfortable silences, and their almost forgotten hopes. Modern medicine already recognizes the power of what are called restorative narratives, stories that help the individual to reorganize their experience of pain so that it does not destroy them, but transforms them. Psalm 77 is, in this sense, an ancestral restorative narrative. He does not erase suffering, but shapes it. It does not eliminate questions, but it shows that they can coexist with faith. And more than that, it reveals that the presence of God can be perceived even where footprints do not appear. Sleeping after reading words like these is not a simple act of rest. It is, in a way, an act of surrender. Because when you close your eyes after letting your soul speak with such intensity, sleep becomes a gesture of trust. It's not just any rest. It is a rest that comes after venting, after remembering, after inner surrender. And perhaps that is exactly where the mystery that science has not yet deciphered lies. The soul finds relief, not by understanding everything, but by knowing that, even in the dark, it is not abandoned. The psalmist's experience, however ancient it may be, continues to resonate in a surprisingly current way. There is no time when people stop seeking meaning in suffering, especially when it manifests itself in the silence of the night. And it is at this point that the spiritual lessons reveal themselves to be most intense. Psalm 77 does not offer immediate relief, nor does it promise a spectacular solution. Instead, he proposes a path, not to deny the pain, but to go through it with sincerity, remembrance, and faith. It is a challenging proposal because it requires courage to look pain in the eye, name it, and still refuse to be defined by it. The first lesson this psalm teaches is that there is no shame in feeling broken. The psalmist does not try to hide his weakness. He doesn't try to appear strong, nor does he try to demonstrate impeccable spirituality. He simply says what he feels. This kind of truth is rarely encouraged. Many learn from an early age to mask pain, to maintain an appearance of stability, and to repeat phrases of faith without real conviction. But here, honesty becomes a door to restoration. Recognizing anguish is the first step so that it does not turn into prison. Another lesson is in the power of remembering. The psalmist makes a deliberate effort to bring to memory the acts of God. He does not expect comfort to come by chance. He builds consolation, brick by brick, with what he once heard, lived, or believed. This attitude reveals that faith is not just a spontaneous feeling, but also a practice. It can be trained, fed, and sustained, even in times of spiritual drought. Remembering is not just remembering facts, but reliving convictions. It is an exercise in inner reconstruction. In a world where everything is instantaneous, where quick comfort and immediate solutions are sought, this type of spirituality sounds almost radical, because it requires time. It demands depth. It's not about repeating promises to stifle pain, but about allowing pain to find its place in the soul's maturation process. And this, although not comfortable, is transformative. The healing this psalm suggests is not superficial. It does not occur on the surface of emotion, but in the foundations of spiritual identity. There is also a powerful teaching about the importance of vulnerability before God. The psalmist does not try to impress. He does not recite praises just out of obligation. He exposes his doubts, his fears, and his suspicions. And it is precisely in this space of radical sincerity that something begins to change. God is not offended by questions. He does not reject confusion. On the contrary, it is in this disorganized soil that he plants the seeds of restoration. Vulnerability, far from being weakness, becomes a fertile space for the divine to act. This perspective transforms the way suffering is understood. It stops being a punishment or an obstacle and becomes a possible scenario for God's action. It is not that suffering in itself is desirable, but it can become useful. It reveals what really matters, what is hidden beneath the layers of distraction and pride. And when suffering is crossed with faith, even if fragile, it leaves different marks. Marks of depth, of empathy, of sensitivity to the pain of others. Another practical dimension of this psalm is the way it invites repetition. It was written to be prayed, sung, or read aloud. And this repetition has a specific spiritual effect. Each reading is a new journey. Each word read or heard opens space for the soul to reorganize itself. There are those who read the psalm once and feel the immediate impact. But there are also those who need to return to it several nights in a row until the heart begins to perceive something that was previously hidden. This process is different from the logic of the modern world, where everything needs to be resolved quickly. Here, healing is not in a hurry. She respects the time of the Spirit. It is interesting to note that, even without offering explicit promises, the psalm conveys a silent hope. It is between the lines, in the fact that the psalmist continues speaking, continues seeking, and continues remembering. He does not abandon his faith, even when it seems fragile. This teaches that faith is not measured by the absence of doubt, but by the insistence on staying connected, even when everything around suggests otherwise. This insistence, this almost stubborn perseverance, is the basis of spirituality that heals. Not a faith that demands immediate answers, but a faith that knows how to wait. Who learns to rest even when the storm has not yet ceased? Who finds relief, not in solving problems, but in the certainty that he is not alone? And this type of healing, however silent it may be, has real effects. It calms the body, organizes thoughts, and rekindles hope. It prepares the heart to sleep without fear, even if the next day is still full of uncertainty. In the end, the psalmist does not say that his problems have been resolved, but he no longer speaks like someone lost. His pain did not disappear, but was transformed into prayer. Your insomnia has not ended, but it has been filled with words that restore. And this is the kind of healing that few realize, but that changes everything. Not all psalms are equal. There are those who stand as monuments of praise, celebrating victories and proclaiming promises with a firm and triumphant voice. But Psalm 77 belongs to another type, a smaller, quieter, but immensely necessary group. It is part of the so-called Psalms of Lament, texts that do not hide pain nor attempt to disguise human vulnerability. And it is exactly this dark tone, this emotional rawness, that makes it so close to those who face their darkest nights in silence. Historically, Psalms of Lament have always held a special place in Israel's tradition. They were used in moments of collective crisis, but also in individual liturgies of confession, crying, or searching for answers. On some occasions, they were recited aloud at vigils, in camps, at moments when the people expected divine intervention, even without knowing when or if it would come. Lament, contrary to what many think, was not a sign of weakness. It was an act of profound faith. Only those who still believe that there is someone listening cry out. There is also something curious. This psalm does not end with a clear resolution. Unlike so many others, he does not close with a declaration of victory or a promise of a response. It still ends in the field of memory and waiting. This may seem uncomfortable, but that's precisely what makes it so true. Because, in the reality of life, not every prayer ends with an immediate answer. Sometimes, what we have is just the echo of our own cry, and the memory of what has already been experienced. And yet, there is comfort in that. This silent comfort that the psalm offers has, in recent years, aroused the interest of even scholars outside the religious field. Psychologists, neuroscientists, and therapists have explored the effects of prayer and Bible reading on mental health, especially during sleep. Certain nighttime reading patterns are reported to reduce anxiety-related brain activity, activate areas linked to emotional memory, and help the body enter deeper states of rest. Evidence like this doesn't explain everything, but it sheds light on something the ancients already knew intuitively. Words have power, especially when read with an open heart. Within this context, Psalm 77 appears as a text that goes beyond its religious dimension. It becomes a kind of spiritual therapeutic tool, an instrument of inner reorganization. When read at night, especially by those facing periods of emotional turmoil, it not only serves as a prayer, but also as a mirror. He does not impose answers, but allows questions. It doesn't offer formulas, but it shares humanity. And this, in itself, already carries a healing power that science has not yet been able to fully translate into graphs or statistics. Perhaps the most counterintuitive element of the psalm is this: it does not attempt to resolve suffering. He welcomes you. And it is in this acceptance that transformation begins. Because ignored pain takes root, but recognized pain can be elaborated, processed, and resignified. There is a type of healing that only happens when suffering is allowed, when the soul is allowed to scream, cry, and question. This psalm validates that cry. He gives language to pain. And this, especially for those who live trapped in silence, is already a liberating act. There is also a symbolic richness in the way creation is mentioned in the final verses. The waters, the thunder, the lightning, the rough sea, all elements that, in many traditions, represent chaos. But here, chaos is the stage for the divine presence. God is not just in moments of calm. He passes through the storms. And even when his footprints are not seen, the text states that he passes by. This image, however poetic it may seem, has profound implications, because it changes the way we perceive pain. It reveals that suffering is not a sign of divine absence, but can be, paradoxically, the place where he is most present, even if silent. On nights of anguish, this truth has immeasurable weight. Knowing that pain does not remove the divine presence, but can be a space for it transforms the way we deal with suffering. It stops being a punishment and becomes a path. Not a desired path, but a possible path. And this is enough for the soul to continue breathing, waiting, and believing. Over the centuries, this psalm has been recited by sick people on beds of pain, by travelers in lonely deserts, by mothers in silent tears, and by priests in empty temples. And in each of these situations, he didn't bring reassurance, but he did offer language. He did not erase the darkness, but lit small flames of meaning. And that is often all you need, a spark to pierce the darkness of your soul without losing yourself completely. Not every miracle happens out loud. Some manifest themselves in absolute silence, in the interval between a contained tear and a calmer breath. Psalm 77 reveals this type of miracle, discreet, interior, often invisible to outside eyes, but which becomes a watershed within those who experience it. He does not promise spectacular answers or instant cures, but it offers something even more precious: the certainty that it is possible to continue even without understanding everything, and that, even on the longest nights, you are not completely alone. This type of healing is deeply underrated. There is a lot of talk about physical cures, about visible transformations, and about turnarounds that draw applause. But silent healing, the one that only the heart itself perceives, is often ignored. Still, it is what sustains it. It is what allows you to sleep after days when everything seems out of place. It is what allows you to get up in the morning, even if nothing has changed on the outside. This healing is more than the absence of pain. It is the presence of meaning. And meaning, when found in the midst of pain, has a power that cannot be manufactured by arguments or formulas. It is the result of real contact with vulnerability, with the memory of divine action, and with the acceptance that some questions may never be answered. Psalm 77 does not resolve dilemmas, he lives with them. And in doing so, it teaches a spirituality that is much more mature than that which is based solely on promises of victory. He shows that faith that resists the absence of signs is more robust than faith that depends on visible miracles. For this reason, this psalm remains current. He speaks clearly to those who suffer in silence, for those who feel ashamed to question, for those who feel guilty for not being able to sleep, for feeling distressed even though they are someone of faith. And he doesn't judge, does not correct, just welcome. This welcoming posture is a breath of fresh air in a world that demands resilience all the time. Here, the broken find space to exist. And more, he finds dignity in the midst of fragility. Sleep, in this context, is no longer just a biological function. It becomes a place where the soul retreats, where faith, even if shaky, is welcomed by words that have passed through centuries without losing their power. Sleep after prayer, after lament, after remembrance, becomes a profound surrender. A silent trust that even without seeing footprints, there is a presence watching over the path. There are records of people keeping this psalm by their bedside. Others recite it as a nighttime prayer, not expecting immediate miracles, but wanting enough peace to rest. And what is often observed is that this simple practice transforms the internal environment. It brings a new order to thoughts, a serenity that does not come from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that the pain has been heard. And this listening, even if it doesn't bring answers, already relieves the soul. The modern world has offered many methods to sleep better: ambient music, blue light control, breathing techniques, and alternative therapies. All of this can help. But there is a space that these solutions do not reach. A deeper space where external silence is not enough. Internal silence is necessary. And this kind of silence is rarely produced by technology. It is born from a reconnection with what is sacred, of an encounter between the human intimate and something that transcends it. It is in this place that the psalm operates. It does not compete with the solutions of science. It offers something that science has not yet been able to deliver. This difference is not contempt for knowledge, but recognition that the human being is more than chemistry and electrical impulses. There is within each person a territory of memory, of faith, of emotion, which needs to be careful with words that go beyond logic. Psalm 77 enters this territory with respect. He doesn't invade, don't force it, just walk alongside. And this walking together is often all that is needed to endure the crossing. It is possible that, at the end of reading this psalm, nothing has changed on the outside. But inside, something shifts. A weight is rearranged. A pain is named. Hope, albeit timid, is rekindled. And that doesn't need proof. The soul knows. She recognizes when she has been touched. And that's exactly why so many people are surprised to wake up after sleepless nights with the feeling that something has calmed down. There is no clear explanation. Just the perception that, at some point in the morning, the internal scream was welcomed by a presence that doesn't need words. This presence is not always explicitly perceived. It often manifests itself in small gestures, in the relief of an obsessive thought, in remembering a verse in the middle of the night, in the simple ability to close your eyes without fear. These signs are discreet, but real. They show that there is a type of care that operates in the invisible, that works while you sleep, that restores from the inside out. The title question remains, why does this psalm heal while you sleep? Maybe because he doesn't try to solve it, but to accompany it. And that is rare. In a time when everyone has ready answers, he offers a listening ear. In a time of rush, he allows pause. In a time of noise, it presents itself as a space of silence with meaning. This combination has an effect that science is still studying, but that the heart recognizes without needing to understand. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If this content made you reflect in any way, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot of deep and thought-provoking stuff coming, and it would be great to have you following along. Also, take the opportunity to leave your like. This helps a lot to keep this work on the air and reach more people. And when you're done here, check out the channel's next video. He brings another perspective that can complement all of this in an unexpected way.